My name is Jordan Steele. I'm your club events manager. So any event that we put on for you, I help plan. If y'all have any ideas or future speaker events that you'd like to see, please call me or email me. But for tonight, we have Mr. Bates, and he doesn't want an introduction, so this is what we're going to do. So everybody, this is Mr. David Bates. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jordan, and thanks everybody for being here tonight to hear about our 41st president in this centennial year of his birth, and about whom Secretary Baker, his close friend, said history will faithfully record that President Bush became one of our nation's finest presidents, and beyond any doubt our nation's very best one-term president. He went on to say, for millions and millions across the globe, the world became a better place because George Bush occupied the White House for 4 years. I had the privilege of working for President Bush on and off from 1978 to 1992 in 3 different capacities. How I started to work for him in the first place was just really a matter of great luck for me. I ran into him on Memorial Day of 1978 at this club in Houston where we had both finished tennis matches, and he asked, I knew him as the father of a friend. Jeb Bush was a friend of mine growing up. But he asked me what I was doing. I said I'd just graduated from law school. I was getting ready to take the bar review exam and then go to work for a law firm in mid-August of '78. And he said, well, listen, I've got a political action committee, and I'm going to be traveling around a lot in this midterm elections of '78, speaking on behalf of congressional and senatorial and gubernatorial candidates. And I need somebody to travel with me. Thank you. I need somebody to travel with me. The fellow that's been traveling with me, the executive director of the Political Action Committee, a fellow named Karl Rove, he wants to spend more time in the office, and he said, why don't you put off going to work for that law firm till mid-November? And I said, well, gee, that just sounds great anyway. I ran home to talk to Ann. We didn't have kids at that point. She was working, and she said, go for it. And I talked to the law firm, and they said, great, we'll see you in mid-November. And off we went in the fall. I think the Political Action Committee rented a King Air, and we flew all over the country speaking on behalf of candidates. And he had told me when I started that depending on the reaction he got, he might run for president in 1980. And I knew by about mid to late October that based on the reaction and the reception he was getting on the campaign trail and the encouragement he was getting to run, that he was, and some things he had said to some friends, that he wanted to run. And I wanted to keep working for him. I asked him if I could, and thankfully he said I could, and so that ended up staying in that role as the personal aide through the Bush for President campaign of 1980 and then the Reagan-Bush campaign. That 1980 campaign is kind of interesting, so I'll spend a little time on it. But it was a very strong field for that 1980 presidential primary, Republican presidential primary. You had Ronald Reagan, who had nearly beat Gerald Ford, for the nomination in 1976. The incumbent president. You had Howard Baker, who was Senate Minority Leader. You had Bob Dole, a senior senator, who was also the VP nominee in '76. You had John Connally, who had been Secretary of the Treasury and Governor of Texas, and a couple of respected Illinois Congressmen, Phil Crane and John Anderson. And for a lot of '79, President Bush was considered a long shot. It was an asterisk in the poll for a lot of '79. For probably 2/3 of that year, it was just the two of us traveling all over the country in coach class most of the time. And we spent a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire. But in January of '89, he won the Iowa caucus in a big upset. And he went on to win the Puerto Rican caucus after that. We came in a strong second in New Hampshire to Ronald Reagan. The next week was the Massachusetts and the Vermont primaries. President Bush won the Massachusetts primary, Reagan won the Vermont primary, and then the field quickly thinned out. It really became a two-man race after that. President Bush would go on to win Connecticut, which in those days was a swing state. Actually, Ford had carried it over Carter in '76. In April, he won the Maine caucus. He won Pennsylvania, big state, big swing state. In May, we had a big win in Michigan in the Michigan primary. But the same day we won the Michigan primary, Reagan won the Oregon caucus, and the networks, all the networks, declared that Reagan had the requisite number of votes to be the nominee. About a week later, after a lot of persuasion from Jim Baker, President Bush withdrew from the race. It was the right thing to do, but he's so competitive. It took a lot of persuasion on Jim Baker's part, but he withdrew from the race. He kept a few people on. He kept the campaign going as a legal entity because he had a little bit of a debt left over, which horrified him to learn that he did. But he paid it off, and he got it paid off. He traveled around in June and got it paid off. He kept a few people on the campaign staff. I was fortunately one of them. But the convention was early that year. It was like mid-July. But all through June and up to early July, there was really no speculation on who Ronald Reagan was going to pick to be his vice president. And we went to the convention. President Bush was scheduled to speak the next to last day of the convention, the third day, which is Wednesday of the convention, by virtue of how well he'd done winning those in the primary. And we got to the third day of the convention. That night, President Bush was going to speak, and Reagan still not made a choice. And I remember we went to, there was a big party lunch, and I think we paid a courtesy call on the Texas delegation. And then I think he went for a jog, and we came back to the hotel to get ready to go to the convention, offer the speech. And I remember getting off the elevator on our floor of our hotel, and they had a television in the foyer of the lobby, and Walter Cronkite was on, and he was talking about very serious discussions between the Reagan and Gerald Ford camps for Gerald Ford to be the VP nominee. And we were all just stunned because, of course, Ford had been president. And they were talking about him being, the VP nominee and possibly president. And anyway, we went to our rooms to get ready, and just more and more talk about that. President Bush went over to give his speech. I remember he was in a little hallway to be introduced to go give his speech, and Jim Wooten from ABC News was there. And President Bush said, "What's the latest on Reagan and Ford?" And Jim Wooten said, "It's a done deal. Their agents or their Secret Service agents are coming over the hall, and they're going to make a joint appearance later tonight." President Bush kind of shrugged his shoulders. He went up to give his speech. Typical of him, it was nothing about himself. It was all about what a great nominee Ronald Reagan would be, and what a great president he'd be, and how the party needed to get behind him and win in November. After the speech, we didn't have Secret Service protection. We walked back to the hotel, and there were, and he told some of us there were a lot of friends that went to the convention. Some of his supporters were delegates. But he said to some of us, get some beer, bring it up to the suite. And we had a little bit of a wait because we thought this was the end of the road. And it broke up, and Jeb and I were one of the last people to leave the suite. I remember we had a room next to the suite where President and Mrs. Bush were, and we'd been in the room about 10 minutes, and there was a knock on the door. And Mrs. Bush said, "Jeb, come in. Your dad wants to say something to you." And David, you come in too. And we walked in, and President Bush said, "Ronald Reagan just called me and asked me to be the VP nominee," and and then 45 seconds later, Bill Livingood, who's head of the Secret Service detail in Houston, who we knew well, walked in the door and said, "Ambassador Bush, I'm your head of the VP nominee detail." And so when Reagan and President Bush talked, they agreed that they were going to have a breakfast the next morning and then a press conference following the breakfast. And after President Reagan called President Bush, he went to the convention hall to announce the pick on that Wednesday night that he had picked President Bush as the VP nominee. But they went the next morning, the last day of the convention, the President and Mrs. Bush went to Reagan's hotel. It was a different hotel. And I could tell on the drive over there that they were very nervous because they really didn't know the Reagans well, and they had heard stories that the Reagans were really reluctant particularly Nancy Reagan was reluctant to pick President Bush 41. She thought, and some of the Reagan staff thought he had stayed in the race too long. Before the Pennsylvania primary, President Bush had called Reagan's economic plan voodoo economics, which is very mild by today's standards, but they took exception to that. But anyway, I could tell they were nervous, and they. But I just remember they got to Reagan's suite, and he opened the door, and he had the big smile on his face and his arms out like this, and I could tell the Bushes immediately kind of relaxed, and they just the four of them had breakfast, and after breakfast they some aides came in and talked about the press conference to follow, and then we went down in this service elevator with the Secret Service and a Reagan aide, and it obviously the breakfast had gone well because they were both friendly and relaxed, the two, President Reagan and President Bush. And President Bush on the way down kind of made a comment about, he said, I wish I'd have worn something, just my suit, a different suit to kind of more match with yours or something. And President Reagan, who loved to tell jokes, and President Bush loved jokes too, but President Reagan said, that reminds me of the joke of the lady whose husband passes away, and she has to go to the funeral home to see her husband, and the funeral home director shows her the work that was done on her husband, and she says, he looks really good. And the only thing is there any way that we could maybe change his suit from blue to gray? I think he'd look a lot better in gray. And the funeral home director thought for a second, then he picked up the phone and he said, Charlie, we changed the heads on 13 and 11. President Bush just broke up, and anyway, they went down. They had a great press conference. Went very well. That night, of course, they were both formally nominated by the convention, and after Reagan was nominated, he gave his acceptance speech. And of course, after he gives his acceptance speech, he kind of takes the cheers of the crowd in, and then the Vice President Bush was to come out on stage and join him, and they do the traditional, lock their arms, and they keep their off arm up in the air and wave to the crowd, and have their other arms around each other's shoulders. And but unfortunately, President Bush kept kind of dropping his dropping his left arm, and I was pretty near the podium, and I was standing with a Reagan aide, a guy named Joe Canzeri, who was an aide to Mike Deaver, but he said, you got to get out there and get him to raise his left arm. And I thought he was joking at first, here we are, millions of people watching this, and but he said, no, you got to get out there, you got to get him, he's got to get his hand up, So anyway, I was in a real dilemma because one, it was, as I said, millions watching, and two, he never was too keen on receiving style advice or sartorial advice. And so, on the other hand, he'd made clear to those of us that were going to be working on the VP nominee staff that he wanted to make it work, and he wanted to do everything he could to make the ticket work and to lead it to victory. So I thought, well, okay, here I go. And fortunately, there was a solid podium that kind of went around the dais, and it kind of came up to their stomachs. So I was able to crawl out there. I crawled out there. I grabbed his pants leg about the cuff and pulled it. And he looked down at me with a look, a kind of a mixture of horror and dismay, but anyway, he did get his left hand up, and anyway, he never said anything to me further about it. And then, the campaign was on. President Reagan asked President Bush to go to China and Japan in August to kind of showcase the bona fides of the ticket. And really, that race against Carter and Mondale, it was from really Labor Day to up until the very end. It was a tied race. It was really within the margin of error. They had one debate. There was no VP debate, and only one presidential debate, and it was 9 days before the election. It was not the Sunday before the election, but the Sunday before that. And we went to it. Reagan, we were in the vicinity. It was in Cleveland. We were kind of in the area, and we actually attended it. But I'll never forget. Then, of course, the last week of furious campaigning, and I think the Sunday before the election, we were campaigning in Pennsylvania and spent the night in D.C. And got up the next Monday, the last day of campaign, the Monday, the day before the election. Got up to fly to Peoria, Illinois to meet Reagan. And Jim Baker got on the airplane with us. He had spent that fall as a senior advisor to the Reagan campaign. He had traveled on their campaign, but I think he was doing Sunday shows in Washington. So anyway, he flew with us from Washington out to Peoria, Illinois. And I'll never forget, he had Dick Worthland's, Reagan's pollsters' numbers from over the weekend, the polling results, and they were just spectacularly good. And I mean, if they were even half right, it was Reagan was going to win easily, and it was, so we felt very good, that day. And then we went to Peoria, Illinois. Illinois was a swing state back then, actually. Ford carried Illinois in '76 and lost Ohio to Carter, but we met Reagan and he was coming from the upper Midwest somewhere. We met Reagan in Peoria, big downtown open air, thousands of people rally, and it was just a beautiful fall day and great event. And then Reagan got on his plane to go to L.A. and we got on our plane to go to Houston. And election was over very quickly. And that night, Reagan won by 10 percentage points in 44 states. Of course, President Bush became vice president. Just a few things about that. You all will recall that early in the administration, just a little over 2 months, there was an assassination attempt on President Reagan, and President Bush VP Bush was in Fort Worth, and when he got the news, he immediately flew back to Andrews, and then got on the helicopter. And on the helicopter into Washington, his lead Secret Service agent and his military aide wanted him to land on the South Lawn for kind of security reasons and continuity of government reasons. President Bush, Vice President Bush said, no, only the president lands on the South Lawn. Let's just have the helicopter take me to the Naval Observatory where the VP residence is, and I'll motorcade into the White House. And of course, Reagan was out for 3 weeks, and President Bush chaired some meetings on his behalf, and but never did anything. Just stayed out of the Oval Office, and I think it made a real impression on President and Mrs. Reagan and the Reagan staff, the way he handled himself in the aftermath of that. Some of his accomplishments in the 8 years as vice president, President Reagan asked him to chair the Drug Task Force, which reduced a lot of burdensome regulations that were either in the pipeline or existing regulations that clearly failed any kind of cost-benefit analysis. He chaired a South Florida Drug Task Force in the 70s, and there was a big drug trade from the Caribbean into Florida, and that the work of that task force really shut that down. And in 1983, President Reagan asked VP Bush to travel throughout Europe to convince the European governments of NATO to deploy the Pershing II intermediate range missile. The Soviets had deployed a SS-20, their own intermediate range missile, which threatened all the European capitals, and really put them in a position to blackmail. Put them in a position where they could use nuclear blackmail against European countries. And 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 if these European governments took the Pershing II missile, it would really be a deterrent. It would check the Soviets, and he was successful. They did take the Pershing II missile. Actually, there was a Wall Street Journal editorial last week talking about the upcoming congressional vote on Ukraine aid, and the Wall Street Journal said that vote is the most consequential since the decision to deploy Pershing II missiles in Europe in the 80s, which the most consequential to U.S. interests in European defense since that decision to deploy those Pershing II missiles. Of course, he was elected president in 1988, and he bucked a lot of odds to be elected president. Not since World War II, actually, to today. No, in the unusual circumstances of World War II, but from World War II until today, there's only been once that the same party has won the presidency 3 times in a row, and that was with Reagan's 2 terms and President Bush. He also had to overcome the Van Buren curse, the Martin Van Buren curse, which was no sitting vice president had won election to president since 1836. And some good ones had failed. You know, Nixon in 60, Eisenhower's VP. Humphrey in 68 had been Johnson's VP, and then and of course Al Gore in 2000 had been President Reagan's. President Bush accomplished he faced an array of challenges as president. He handled them flawlessly. He accomplished a great deal in 4 years. In terms of foreign policy, my opinion, but I can't find another foreign policy record better than his in the history of our country. Just to kind of go through some of the significant activities and accomplishments. In May of '89, a very surgical operation into Panama to remove, to basically arrest Manuel Noriega. There was combat because he had security. He had the security forces, but Noriega had been indicted in U.S. federal court for drug trafficking. He had also annulled a free and fair election. And then when his security forces killed one of our Marines at a checkpoint, that's when President Bush said, "We're going in," and they got him and they arrested him, and he did his time in prison here. I think he passed away in prison. But December of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, followed by the collapse of other communist governments in Eastern Europe. When the Berlin Wall fell, there were many in Congress, both parties, and a lot of his own advisors and political supporters said, "You got to get to the Berlin Wall and celebrate this. I mean, this is you got to go over there and give a speech and celebrate this." President Bush said, "That's the last thing in the world I'm going to do." Gorbachev is not. He unlike Khrushchev in '56 against Hungary or Brezhnev in '68 against Czechoslovakia, President Bush Gorbachev did not send in the Soviet military to put down the uprising in Europe, and so as usual, he was kind of thinking about the country and not about his own, political fortunes. Later in '90, President Bush and Secretary Baker vigorously pushed the unification of Germany, and for Germany to become a member of NATO. And they had to overcome the initial strong objections of Margaret Thatcher, Francois Mitterrand of France, and Gorbachev, because they all had recent memories of World War I and World War II, and but they did persuade those countries to agree, and it's been a great thing for Europe and of course the world. The first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in August of '90. President Bush shortly thereafter says this will not stand. He puts together a coalition of 42 countries that gets a UN and a congressional resolution. And the UN resolution, Soviet Union and China, they could have vetoed it and they didn't. The resolution said that if Saddam Hussein's not out of Kuwait by a certain date, a use of force could be used. Of course, we know it was. It was a President Bush. He said his hardest decision as president was, without a doubt, was sending men into combat into Panama and in the first Gulf War. And I think because he'd been in combat himself, he was the youngest naval pilot when he joined up. But he lost a lot of friends in World War II, and he was just very reluctant to send people into combat. But as we know, it was successful. He and Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they had a similar philosophy. Let's use overwhelming force. Let's get this over quickly so it doesn't drag out. The cost of the operation was $62 million. James Baker passed the hat. It was fully paid for. The United States didn't even have to pay any money for it. President Bush had Billy Graham to the White House the night before the invasion. I think just because of those concerns about sending men into combat. But of course, we know the Soviet Union fell later in 1991. As Bob Gates said, it's the only time in history that a great empire has fallen without war causing the fall of the empire. On the domestic front, he accomplished a lot. One thing that's very notable, President Bush faced the largest opposition majorities in Congress of any president in history. So he had a tough. He had a tough field to play in. Nevertheless, working with Congress, legislation was passed in his administration dealing with financial institutions, the environment, energy, child care, surface transportation, civil rights, American Disabilities Act. What he's really known for on the domestic side, there are really four things. One, the budget deal in 1990. It's the largest deficit reduction deal in history. It put spending caps in place. It introduced pay-go, which is the congressional term for if any new entitlement or any new regular spending or entitlement spending has to be matched by cuts elsewhere in the budget. Clinton kept to the deal, and as did Republican Congresses, and it led to the balanced budgets in the late 90s. The Clean Air Act's amendments of 1990, among other benefits, significantly reduced ozone or smog and acid rain, which had been a real problem, particularly in the Northeast. And it did it through kind of market-based means, cap and trade program, as opposed to kind of a command and control operation. And then, of course, the Americans with Disability Act, something he cared a lot about and campaigned for in 1988 campaign, which really allowed the disabled to enter the mainstream of society and fully enter the American workforce. Lastly, I could have put this under foreign policy too, but NAFTA was negotiated in his administration. It was actually signed in October 1992 here in San Antonio by Presidents Salinas and Bush and Prime Minister Mulroney, and they sent it to their respective Congresses in December, and then it was passed by our Congress in 1993 under Clinton. Under Clinton. What was President Bush like as a person? I know I've seen many people here tonight who know him well, and so they can attest, I think, to what I'm going to say. But he was a very fun person to be around. He was a very upbeat, positive person. He very thoughtful. He may have set the Guinness World Book of Record for handwritten notes, in the country. He loved sports. He's a good tennis player. He was very competitive, but always a good sport. He actually played baseball at Yale. He was starting first baseman on the Yale baseball team that went. It was in the finals of the College World Series. He was great to work for. He was a very fair-minded man. He led by example. He engendered a great deal of loyalty from the people that worked for him. He had an incredibly strong work ethic. He was in the Oval Office every morning at 6:45. and a great sense of humility. He used to drive the speechwriters and his aides kind of crazy because usually there were things to brag about, accomplishments in his administrations. But anytime they had that, I did this or I propose, he'd cross it out and say we or my administration. And the only time he used I was when something went wrong, which was rare. But that was the only time he would use I. He was a person of great integrity. In the almost 3 years as his personal aide, being with him almost every day, I never saw him cut a corner. And he was a person of his word. If he made a commitment, he kept it. And I think that's what allowed him to be so successful as a foreign policy president, and successful with those large Democratic majorities in the Congress that he faced, and get the legislation that he did domestically. And finally, he was a selfless patriot. I heard him often say at the White House that, let's just, when a decision was to be made, he said, let's just do the right thing for the country. We'll sort out the politics later. And I think, the budget deal, we all remember at the '88 convention, he said, read my lips, no new taxes. But in his first year, there were no new taxes in the budget in his first year. But for the second year, it was the spending was there was early in the administration. He had to deal with the S&L crisis, and it really caused a big spike in spending. And he knew that, and at the same time as he was trying to get a budget done, he was trying to rally the country around the first Gulf War, and so he very reluctantly, but he said, we're going to have to raise taxes. And he wrote in his diary that night, he said, I probably cost myself the president. I could well have cost myself the presidency in 1992, but I see no other way to do it. And we got to do it for the good of the country. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall example, where he said no, he wasn't going to gloat, wasn't going to grandstand. He didn't want to rub Gorbachev's face in it. He was worried Gorbachev would that the military, that the military may force Gorbachev to send them in. Or maybe even deposed Gorbachev, and so he never gloated, and so that was the kind of man he was, and I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Yeah. Too quick. Yeah. Charles and then John. Here. Yes.
David, you've described the good old days so well here, as reflected with George Bush, and you mentioned his affinity for tennis, and you're coming out with him there from the tennis matches at the outset. My wife Cindy reminded me of a tennis story that you might have that I think you know what I'm talking about.
Right. I think I do. And we were playing tennis at the White House, a doubles match, and he had to take a call in the Oval Office. I'd probably use a secure phone. And but before he went in the Oval Office, he went and put on his suit. And because he would not set foot in the White House, he would not set foot in the Oval Office without a coat and tie. And when he came back out, he said, "I'm sorry, I'm a little late. I had to change to take that. Had to change to take a call in the Oval Office." So, but that was the way. He wouldn't get off. He wouldn't get off the helicopter on the South Lawn without a coat and tie, and he wouldn't get off the airplane, Air Force One at Andrews without a coat and tie. And he had great respect for the office, and that was it. Yeah. John. Yeah. Yes, John.
So, David, with your usual humility, you've said very little about yourself. Why don't you tell us what you were doing during both the two Reagan terms and the Bush term as president?
Okay. Well, thanks, John. Well, the personal aid days, it was what you'd kind of expect. It was just There was no, that was before internet and cell phone. I don't even think they had, I don't even think fax machines were in the late 70s were ubiquitous back then. But just trying to keep him on schedule and to make sure he had his remarks and knew who to thank and help him with thank you notes afterwards. And of course, when the Political Action Committee, I remember at night I'd get to the hotel room, and one reason I knew he was going to run for president, I'd just empty my pockets of business cards and note cards of people who said if he runs, I want to help him, and I'd names and addresses for him, which we'd get back to Houston, and they'd get a letter from him saying if I decide to run, you're gonna, But that was that in the vice president's office from '86 through the '88 campaign. I was deputy chief of staff and kind of a jack of all trades role, and really the person in the office that dealt with first his political committee, his political action committee, and then his campaign for the 1988 campaign for president. And try to make sure the left hand and the right hand knew what he was doing. And then when he became president, I became cabinet secretary of the cabinet. And when I first took the job as secretary of the cabinet, when he said to me, "Listen, I want my cabinet to feel like they're part of the team. So, you need to make sure that they always feel like they're in the loop and part of the team." And I think he was very solicitous of their feelings because he'd been a cabinet secretary in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and he spent a lot of time with his cabinet. He had a lunch with a different cabinet member about once a month. I remember for spring of '89, a beautiful spring night, he invited the cabinet and spouses to dinner in the Rose Garden, a memorable evening. Fall of 1990, early fall of 1990, he invited the cabinet and spouses out to Camp David. Most of them had never been to Camp David. For activities during the afternoon, I still remember a spirited doubles match of Jack Kemp was with his shirt off and Mrs. Bush biting her tongue, and but then followed by a dinner in the main lodge at Camp David. About every 3 or 4 months, he tried to have lunch in the Roosevelt Room with his sub-cabinet agency heads. That's like NASA and Office of Personnel Management and General Service Administration, OPIC and Ex-Im Bank, National Endowments for the Humanities. Those, but he would have lunch. He'd kind of give some brief remarks, and then have them go around the table, and each of them talk for like 5 minutes about what their agencies were doing and their major priorities and how they were doing on them. He met with the full cabinet about once a month, and those meetings were informational. Usually have the Dick Darman, the O&B director, would talk about the budget process and the budget negotiations, or the economic advisor to the president would talk about the economy or the annual report, and Jim Baker would brief after he got back from a foreign minister meeting, or the president would brief about his return from a G7 meeting. I remember Sam Skinner, the Secretary of Transportation, briefed about the Exxon Valdez cleanup and spill cleanup, and President Bush even talked about the Tiananmen Square, even though it had been addressed in the National Security Council what the response would be to Tiananmen Square, what the sanctions would be. He wanted to tell the full cabinet, just so they, because these cabinet members, they travel around the country a great deal to talk about the issues in their portfolio. But when they're out in the country, they're the administration's representative, and so when they do a press availability, they're going to be asked questions outside their portfolio. So the president wanted to know about the big issues of the day and what we were saying about them. The decision-making bodies of the cabinet were kind of split, with the Economic Policy Council and Domestic Policy Council, which would develop options for the president, options papers, and then the president would meet with those sub-cabinet heads and make his decisions. And so that kind of what that job entailed, and I was trying to keep that as fully on track as possible. So anyway, yes, Quincy.
Any Mark McKinnon stories, or have you thought about writing a book?
I'm sorry, any
Mark McKinnon.
Oh, no, you know, I no Mark stories. I haven't thought, I never, I've done a couple of oral histories, and but I've just never done a book, but anyway, so yeah, yes.
If you play tennis, who would win the match?
Well, it just depended. But I got to play with him a fair amount on his team, which was great, and we had a pretty regular match. Some folks we would play, which was I think the final ended up being like 10. We won 10 matches, they won 9, so it was a very competitive match. But I played against him on a few occasions. Of course, the most memorable for me was, this is a little bit of a name dropping, but was in Australia, where we played with Tony Roach and John Newcomb. I played with Tony Roach, and he played with John Newcomb. But anyway, but he didn't. He was, as I said, very competitive. He didn't like to lose, but he was always a good sport. But he also didn't. He didn't want anybody going easy against him. Any opponent going. I mean, he would never play with you again if he knew you went easy on him. So he didn't mind losing to you, but he didn't want you to go easy on him. So yeah, yes, Larry.
David, I'm always interested on the speeches.
Yes.
You said the speechwriters.
Yes.
And the I versus we.
Yes.
But his preparation for speeches and adjusting speeches. Tell me a little bit about how he prepared.
Well, I think at the end of his presidency, his post-presidency, he would have told you that he really didn't devote as much time as he should to the communication side of the presidency. And to his speeches. He was extremely hard worker, very action oriented, and I think he thought of kind of speech making as kind of a little bit of fluff, and it's not really real work. And but speech making is really important, you know, and effective speech making can help move an issue, and you know, as Winston, we looked at, you know, and Ronald Reagan did spend a great deal of time on his speeches, and I think that's one thing, and I think I even maybe remember hearing him talking a little bit post-presidency that, yeah, I should have spent some more time on my speeches and giving speeches. I remember he told me he talked to President Reagan. I remember Reagan's famous speech at D-Day in 1984 at Pointe du Hoc, where he gave the speech, and I remember President Bush talked to him afterwards, and he asked President Reagan. He said, "How did you keep from crying?" He said, I'd have cried if I'd have given that speech. And President Reagan said, "What I do is I just go over it and go over it and go over it and go over it, to where by the time I deliver it, I've gotten the emotion part. I've kind of put the emotion part aside." So, but yeah, that's on the speech making. Yeah. Any others? Yes. Okay.
What do you think our generation, speaking as a 30-something, can kind of learn and take away from President Bush? Yeah, so much.
but I think they may, you know, so much. But you know, I think just, you know, putting the country first. You know, putting the country first, and you know, yeah, just putting the country first. So, yes.
Got a kind of a follow-up to that. You've seen a lot, you know, I think of your era with Bush as the good old days in a way, and we're living in a new generation today, and, you know, Justice Department is weaponized, FBI is weaponized, news cycles weaponized, social media, which wasn't even an impact back then, is hugely weaponized. How do you view, from your perspective, then versus the environment we're living in today?
Well, it was a different time. It was less partisan. It was a less partisan time. I think a lot of the people that were in Congress when President Bush, during the Reagan administration, and really up until the end of his presidency, a lot of his peers, Democratic Party and Republican Party, they had fought in World War II, and they really saw kind of a larger purpose to things than the political battle, and so it was a different time in that regard. I will say President Bush's administration, in terms of, it was Dick Thornburgh was our Attorney General for most of the administration, and it was a straight arrow operation. As a matter of fact, yeah, I mean it was and really no one. I would talk to him about, because he chaired the Domestic Policy Council, and I'd talk to him about, but I didn't talk to him. Nobody in the White House talked to him about anything having to do with any enforcement matter except for our counsel to the president, a guy named Boyden Gray. It was a very, I mean, it was really two separate things, and I do hope that, I think both sides are, you know, too much trying to put each other in prison. You know, I mean, I think both sides could today. I think both sides should get back to addressing we've got some serious structural problems in the country that we need to address, and I think that we need to quit trying to one up each other and address them. So. Any other? Yes.
Well, it's not a question, but it's a comment that I think also that President Bush was such an honest and loyal and just humble man. I think that's something we don't see today, and that's what makes the big difference. It's not I deny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cared for everything.
Yeah. That would be my daughter who said that. Yeah. So anyway, so I really appreciate everybody coming.